everyone. This is Talkback. It is Tuesday, January 19th, 2021. Wow, we have had a tumultuous year. It's still going on. We are facing a pandemic in this country that we have to take care of. The vaccine is coming on board. We're having the inauguration of a new president. We've had threats to our democracy, our way of life, the rule of law. What else can happen? But notwithstanding all of that, the question is America still the beacon of hope for people around the world who are seeking refuge? To help me talk about this question is Helen Elperina. She's a physics teacher from Brantford. She lives in New London County. Helen is coming on the screen now. Hi, Helen. It's good to see you.
Hello.
Okay. So I introduced you. I know you're a teacher of the year in physics at Brantford High School. You live in New London County. You're involved in the Jewish community. You are on the board of the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut. And you're going to be part of our important program in April, Seeking Refuge from Shanghai and Beyond, talking about the search of Jews through millennia for refuge in various countries. America being the one that you sought refuge from the Soviet Union, our Holocaust survivors who sought refuge in America, but also in Israel, in Shanghai, in Cuba, and other parts of the world that would take them in. So we're so happy to have you as part of that program and to preview it all with a discussion with you today. So Helen, tell everybody, when did you arrive in America? And then we'll go backwards. When did you get here?
We were able to leave Soviet Union after many years waiting during Gorbachev's time. It was 1989, and we came to New London area actually on December 4th, 1989, and reside here since that. And we love the country. We enjoyed all these years. It's the best thing we did in our life. I came with my husband and two little kids. They were 4 and 12. And we were able to establish our life here.
Wonderful. So when I go back and think, when I was in the 1980s working here and getting involved a little bit in politics in the Jewish community, we were marching, we were advocating, we were organizing to help the Soviet Jews to come here. And of course, so many of us have backgrounds in Russia. My mother and my grandmother and her sister came, the three of them, escaping from Ukraine, southern Ukraine, over the border into Romania in 1921. So many of us in the Jewish community in Eastern Connecticut have very similar stories. But I want you to go back and give us a little bit of history. Tell us about the Jews in the Soviet Union, how far back they go and how far back that you know that your family goes.
It's a very interesting question. We could spend an hour talking about it, but to talk, to give a short answer. 19th century, as 18th century actually also, were difficult time for Jewish people in Russian Empire. The Russian Orthodoxy was afraid of competition with different religion at that time, and because of it, Jews were basically forced to leave behind Pale of Settlement, which were basically covered what is today Belarus, Ukraine, part of Moldavia. But the life was very, very difficult. Many professions were closed. Many field of study and even where you could live was very, very much limited. And that was very much the reason of wide participation of Jews in Russian Revolution in 1917. If to summarize it quickly, I would say that the fate of Jewish community in 20th century was divided into three streams. Part of the group was able to escape to the United States. It was very difficult to do, but uh, some percentage of population was able to do it. Part of the population was able to escape to Palestine, which was at that time also kind of nobody's land, and they established themselves there. And many more were left in Russia and tried to build the life after the revolution. So my family was not exclusion. Part of my family was able to leave to the United States at the beginning of the century, and part of the family I'm from was stuck in Russia and couldn't leave until 1989.
Okay, so it's interesting. You talk about how some of the Jews, again, like my family and those who came at the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, the millions that immigrated into America, and a small part going to the beginning of the state of Israel, beginning of Palestine in the early 1900s. But much of your family was left there because you grew up there in Minsk. And so your family got caught up in World War II and in the Holocaust. And as a matter of fact, you've been involved in the Encountering Survivors program of the Strauchlitz Holocaust Resource Center at the Jewish Federation. And you participated in talking about your family's struggles during the war, especially your father, who just recently died. So tell us about your father's experiences as a Holocaust survivor, actually.
When I think about life of my parents, my father and my mother, they went not only through the Holocaust, they went through all horrors of Stalin's empire, through Stalinism. And that was absolutely terrible time when millions of people died in concentration camps in Russia, in Gulag. And my father always told me stories about his life during that time. We're talking about 1934, 1940s, when he was a little kid. He was afraid even to talk at school about what is his name and what is his last name and where the family lives, because he knew that it's dangerous to repeat to anybody anything about what's about the family. The fear of everybody's spying on everybody was horrific. So, but that was not enough. In 1941, Russia was attacked by Nazis Germany, and at that time, Minsk, which is the place where they lived, it's a big city, it was Jewish city at that time, was taken by Nazis in 4 days. And my father, who was at that time, I would say 9 years old, he was able to press his family from the first day of war to drop everything and just to leave. They couldn't take a train. They didn't have any transportation. You had to go by foot miles and miles until you would be able to get on a train. And it's a long story, but basically he was the reason that family survived and ended up in Kazakhstan, where they had to work extremely hard His father was in the army fighting Nazis, and he and his mother and the little brother were working extremely hard just to survive. So the war was World War II was a terrible experience, but they were so lucky. He always was telling me how lucky they were because they survived. And most of Jewish population in Minsk didn't survive. Anybody who didn't make this decision in the first 4 days of the war, everybody who didn't leave didn't survive, almost everybody. Many people in my husband's family, in my family, many relatives were killed in Minsk ghetto. And I think that's why my parents always felt that they're the luckiest one, because they survived. Few of them survived from big families.
Right. And you did believe that it was your dad, was it not, who really spurred the family on? Is that really the truth, or is that what
It is it is absolutely truth, and he was the one who was insisting of dropping everything and leaving as quickly as possible. And it was a long journey, and it was a very difficult journey. But because of him, they survived. The other reason they survived had to do with a very interesting coincidence when during first day of the war, a young couple, Jewish couple from Poland, who was escaping from Nazi-occupied Poland, stopped on their way in my grandmother's house, and these two young, new married young people, they said, leave right away, drop everything. You don't understand, Nazis will kill everybody. And that was another reason they dropped everything and left with nothing.
So the Jews in the Soviet Union, they had to worry about Stalin and Stalinism and persecutions that he put upon the Jewish people, and then of course the Nazis, and millions of Soviet Jews died in World War II, and your family was very lucky. So after the war, tell us your father and his family, did they come back to Minsk and reestablish life there? How did that work?
They came back to Minsk. He came with his parents. He felt incredibly lucky that his father and mother and brother were all there. They live in a lone street. I think it was Заречная улица, the name of the street. And there was a big Jewish family who lived in the street before World War II, with house after house which belonged to that different branches of this family. There was one person survived from big family, and he survived only because he was fighting in the army. The rest of the people in this big family disappeared. So my father felt that he was very lucky, and if I look at his life, and that's why I always have this perspective when people are dramatic, I look at his life, at my mother's life. Their life, with all their horrors, was in progression of, they thought that it was becoming a little bit better. After World War II was Khrushchev's time, Stalin's time, which was terrible, but after that it was Khrushchev's time, when life became a little bit easier. And after that, it was the time of Brezhnev and Soviet socialism and all its beauty, where life was still horrible, but it was a little bit better than after war. So I
Okay.
think it helps in a way to survive, to healthy perspective, compare it to what it was in the past.
All right, and tell us about your mother. At some point, your dad met your mother. What was the situation with her family? Did she also experience some terror during the war for her family members?
It was the same thing. They survived by miracle. They survived only because they were able to escape during the first few days of the war. As her father was in the army, her mother, who was a doctor, was given responsibility of managing big hospital for facial wounds in Udmurtia, which is very much on the edge of Soviet Union, and that's where she spent her childhood. It was a very poor life. Um, Sometimes I tell my students about it because even when we have the situation with quarantine and we feel that it's really difficult for kids to be locked at home and not to see each other and not to see the relatives, sometimes I try to remind them that there were times when it was much more difficult. My parents did not go to school for 4 years because either there was no school or they didn't have shoes to go to school. My father at some point had to go to school at the end of the war in his mother's shoes, and all kids were making fun of him. They didn't have anything else. And he had to bring his own stool, something to sit on, because school didn't have anything. So, as with everything, it's important to have a perspective. It is difficult now, but people had and lived through more difficult situation and got nevertheless a wonderful education and got nevertheless absolutely great life experience.
Mhm.
So
So,
we will survive that too.
right. So the other thing that strikes me is you have had a great education. So, and your dad too, notwithstanding the terror, the horror of the political situation that made life difficult for Jews, your father was able to get a good education. Tell us about what he achieved. He was a professor or a PhD
No,
himself.
he was um, he was also a physics teacher, and but I didn't meet in my life anybody as brilliant and well educated as he was. And it was mostly all self educated. He read a lot, he knew world history, he knew in and out sciences. He was just a very, very broadly educated person. But he was absolutely loved by his students. But what's important to understand, yes, my my parents, my grandparents, they all were educated. But what's important to understand in Soviet Union, in the country of developed socialism, education would not give you anything. Um, Doctors and teachers and engineers were paid less than qualified workers. And the way the structure was built, that on the top of the pyramid were proletarians, and they were supposed to be better than everybody else. And professionals were treated very poorly. You would get education for yourself, but you would be as poor as everybody else around you. So to be educated means that you have a love for learning, that you want to be educated, but it had nothing to do with final reward, living better life in terms of earning more money. In some way, everybody was equally poor, except
So,
people on the top.
So that's interesting. So describe when your parents married, and you were born in the 50s, probably, right?
Yes.
Okay. And
Yeah.
tell us what life was like for you growing up. And again, you're very well educated, and brilliant. I think you started out as an electrical engineer and then physics teacher, chemistry, and so on. How did that work out? It's hard for me to get my arms around that you were afforded the ability to get a fantastic education, and yet it had such a different meaning in the Soviet Union than it might for us here in America. So kind of explain that to us.
I will try. So imagine that you live in a big cage, and cage is so big that you don't know where is the boundary. And if you don't push yourself to the side, you would never know that you're in a cage. That's very much analogy of what life in Soviet Union was for most of people. You live your own life. For being Jewish, many professions were close to us. The general fields which were open, and I have to explain that in socialist country we live in, the government would assign for you the job. So you would go to college, and you would graduate. And usually, what was open for us was teaching or engineering. And after that, government will tell you where to go to work. And chances are you will not change your job most of the time, because it was very difficult to find a job if you're Jewish. But it was difficult. It was a difficult life. You kind of, probably it's different in every family. In my family, my parents were very open with us about true meaning of living in socialism. They were very open with us about the whole lie the system is based on, but they were also very clear about explaining to us that we cannot share this knowledge with anybody except very, very, very trusted friends. So you, in a way, become an internal immigrant and live your life without trying not to be in conflict with the system. And the minute the opportunity opened to immigrate, which was basically opened by Gorbachev, we just dropped everything and left. And it's a simplified story, but that's how it's happened.
Right. So I want to talk about the Jewish quality of your life. So as you were growing up, Helen, in Minsk, and by the way, I guess much of the Jewish population in Minsk was destroyed during the war. So Minsk still had a significant Jewish population when you were growing up, or much smaller than before the war, I imagine. But what was it like with your thoughts of your Jewish heritage, your religion? How did you practice? How did you feel? And what were the restrictions that you felt about fulfilling your Judaism?
So we have to go to Russian Revolution, back to 1917. Basically, my model is that socialism, the way it was built in Russia, in a way it was a religion. But instead of God, there was Lenin and later Stalin. And basically, when you have this kind of religion, all other religions had to go. So that was the reason of extreme denial of religious life for any religions. Christians, Muslims, and Jews, in some way, were all limited, basically couldn't practice religion. Most of the synagogues, most of the churches were closed. So in some villages, there were active churches, but the way it was working, if somebody who is, for example, a teacher would be caught um, going to a church to baptize his child, for example, there may be an article in the newspaper and he would lose his job or his family or his wife. So religion was forbidden. And our grandparents knew, who grew up in Jewish religious families, they were very careful not to tell us too much. But I think the spirit of love of learning and the spirit of Judaism in a way which exhibited itself very differently was always alive in our families. More than anything, it exhibited itself in um, love of learning, like people of the book. You learn, you constantly learn something, and you do it just because. But also there were simple, funny moments. For example, I was watching my mother's cooking, and she would prepare meat, and she didn't know what is kosher. Nobody knew it at that time, but she would put salt on meat and said, it has to stay under salt, salted for half an hour. And I would say, why? And she said, I don't know, my mother would do it. So there were elements which survived, but most of the things were lost.
So if you had the the annual holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, Hanukkah, were any of those observed in any way? Did you think about them? Did you read about them? Was there any restriction in even getting books about those topics? Tell us about that.
Of course not. I mean, as I said, religions and especially Judaism, Judaism was basically forbidden. So there was no mention of these holidays. Nobody celebrated it. Nevertheless, and it's the same happened in Christian families during Passover, during Easter time. In our family, during Passover time, somebody would call and very carefully let us know that matzah is available, but he would not even say the word matzah on the telephone. He would say M. And how much do you need? And my parents would order it, and we would have matzah for what happened to be Passover. But we knew absolutely nothing about meaning of it, and we lost everything, including the language. My parents, both of them, and grandparents, everybody spoke Yiddish, and I could only understand it slightly, my husband too, and our kids have no clue. So a lot of things were lost.
So I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned before that some of your families came to America, were able to get out in the early 1900s. And you have been in touch with them and their children and their cousins and so forth. Was there communication at all when you were growing up with your parents and the family members that had already come to America?
It's an interesting question. Let's come back to Stalin's time. During Stalin's time, if somebody would know that you have relatives in the United States or in Belgium or in France, that didn't matter. If you have relatives in capitalistic society, you become automatically enemy of the state. So all communication between families were closed, and the initiative to close communication suddenly came from my grandparents because they were afraid of the family surviving. And only after World War II, when Stalin died, American family was able to find us and they found us through Red Cross and I think UNESCO too. And that's when communication started. They were absolutely wonderful people. They were very close with us. They visited many times. And when we came to the United States, finally, we found ourselves to be part of a wonderful big family.
Yeah. So we know that Stalin murdered millions in the Soviet Union, Jewish poets, Jewish writers, many people. Did you know anybody who was punished or who was executed by Stalin because they tried to exercise their rights as a Jew or as an opponent of the regime, of Stalin's regime?
It's hard to explain to Americans what did it mean at that time to live in Soviet Union and you're in Stalin's time. I will give you a story about my great uncle. They live in a small, he lived with his family, with 8 other families in a small house near Moscow. And we are talking about 1937. It was the kind of top of Stalin's persecution time. So one day, one of the neighbors, and they had a habit of talking, getting together and talking. One of the neighbors told some mild joke about Stalin, and it was very mild and nobody paid too much attention. The same night, all 8 men, husbands from all 8 families were arrested. And out of them, just 2 survived. They came back 20 years later. When my great uncle was, when he was arrested, his son was 4 years old when he came back. Surviving by miracle, his son was 24. So life during Stalin's time was life in constant fear. People disappeared without any reasons. Sometimes they were accused of being spies. As a matter of fact, my great uncle was accused of being Polish spy because he was born close to the border with Poland. That was the reasoning. But nobody needed any proofs. People were dying in millions, and that was the atmosphere at that time. And very few of them survived.
So when you were growing up, as you mentioned, it's all about perspective and relativism. By the time you were growing up in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you couldn't get out yet, but things were lightening up a bit. I just wanted to go back to something that you talked about when we were preparing for this discussion, and that is the city of Minsk became a very Jewish city, but the history of that goes back to when our forefathers, your ancestors, mine, lived in the shtetls in the Ukraine, in Belarus,
Yep.
right, parts of Russia. And then tell us about the transformation from the shtetl life into the city, where Minsk became a big haven for Jews at a certain point.
It's really a very interesting question. I think what's happened, people who lived in shtetl, they were locked up. They didn't have any prospect during Russian Empire, Russian time. They didn't have any rights. And when revolution happened and the gates, so to speak, opened, they were able to leave shtetls and go to any place they could. And usually they went to bigger cities or bigger towns. And because they all were educated in Judaism, they all went through bar mitzvah, they knew how to learn. Very quickly, they discovered that they were good learners. So they became they became, right from shtetl, they became doctors and lawyers, and they was only, in a way, they were small part of literate population. Not when revolution happened, peasants and proletarians, they were very active in revolution, some of them, but they were very often at the beginning illiterate. So people from shtetl created a bridge. They was the one which created a new professional class because they were able to learn quickly.
Right.
So, and that's why actually all four of my grandparents came from shtetl, the same as my husband's family, but they all became professionals. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all, but at least the door was open for them.
Okay, so just to let everybody in our audience know, the revolution started in 1917. By the time we got through with the Civil War, it was 1922 when Lenin really established the Soviet Union, and from his reign came Stalin, right? So, and I also remember you telling me that one of the shtetls that some of your family came from was the same shtetl as the great artist Chagall, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a small shtetl near Vitebsk called Lyozna, and that's where Mark Chagall came from, and my grandmother came from. And she would tell me stories that she would remember Chagall's family from the times they were kids.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very nice. All right. So now you mentioned before that there were certain professions that were closed to the Jews, and your dad was a physicist. And tell us, you went to school and you studied electrical engineering and physics. What were the professions that were closed to the Jews, and how did you, amongst the limited choices you had as a Jew, how did you decide what you were going to do?
It's the choices were limited. As I said, it was almost impossible after 1970s to become, for example, a doctor, or it was completely impossible to become a lawyer. But you could go. There was always need for engineers, so polytechnical institutes were open, and the same is true about teaching institutes. But even with that, if you get a profession and they tell you that it's free education, it's really not free because you pay with it. They take money from you. They leave you, government leaves you with nothing. Just to give you perspective of how to live on a salary of professional engineer. The beginning salary for professional engineer was around 110 rubles per month. And to buy a pair of winter shoes, winter boots, for example, would cost the same 110 rubles. So you had to count every penny, you had to count everything, you had to be very careful, and you manage, but you just have to be smart about surviving. And
What about housing, Helen? Were there apartments with multi-families, and what were the costs for that? Was any of that subsidized by the
it's
state?
as it's when people say everything will be free, for me it's very funny because nothing is ever free. In Soviet Union, education was free, they say, and housing was cheap. But first of all, it wasn't free because we were not paid. But secondly, government was managing everything, and there were families which lived in so-called communal apartments where could be 8, 10 families sharing one kitchen and one bathroom. My parents were very lucky when we grew up. I actually, first couple of years of my life, yes, they spent in communal apartment where most of the people who lived there were teachers, like my grandparents. But later, Khrushchev developed the program to build so-called Khrushchevki, which were standard 1-2 bedroom apartments, very small, but you wouldn't imagine how happy everybody was to have separate living space because it was impossible to get. And if you have an apartment, you felt really, really well off because you have your own space. My husband's family, just to give you a sense, at some point in 2-bedroom apartment, they had 11 people, 4 generation, 2 grandparents, 2 parents, 2 children, and one of the kids have its own children there.
And,
So
and that was the norm, right?
That was the norm. That was the norm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as you're growing up in Minsk, and I gather there's a world outside. What books, TV, what outside sources of knowledge did you have, and did you ever develop a yearning to leave? How did that, how were you feeling inside about all of that? And did you have the means to become educated about what else there was out there besides the life in Minsk?
So the desire to leave was very similar if somebody in your circle will say, I would love to go and live on the moon. It was impossible to leave. And you were locked in. You couldn't even go to visit Bulgaria or a socialist country. You were not trusted. They were afraid that you would escape. Iron Curtain was a real thing. Zero information was coming to Soviet Union. So the only source of information had to do with Western radio. And my grandfather, every evening, and I remember him like now, would close all curtains, and he would sit next to this big radio. At that time, they were huge. And he would listen to BBC in Russian or Voice of America in Russian. KGB was trying very, very hard to destroy the signal, but nevertheless, he and my father later were getting all information from Western radio stations. In terms of how do you survive in a country which is based on lying, on false ideas, in a way, I would say and I am talking only about my family. I couldn't say that it's typical, but you learn very early that majority is not always right. You are in a way vaccinated. You don't believe in any propaganda. And you just learn to think for yourself. And very much I have to say that I try to apply the same principles living in the United States. I try to go through my own filters and not to rely on any particular radio station and any particular newspaper. We try to read widely on different languages to get broader sense of what's going on, because nobody has full truth.
Right. How about, you mentioned that your grandfather and your dad were able to get through with the radio signals. What about when TV came along and books? Were many books that you might read to give you a sense of freedom? Were they censored? And
They will have, first of all, TV was government TV, and it was heavily loaded with propaganda. The books were heavily censored, not to say that nothing that was not written by communist authors was published. So from Soviet government was very careful which writers to translate and to publish. So, for example, as strange as it is, Steinbeck was translated because he was more or less on the left. And he was very sympathetic to communist Russia at the beginning. But many other American writers were not translated. So you wouldn't get too much from the book either because books were not available. When Gorbachev came to power, all of this opened up. And
Right.
books and translations, everything, things started to be published very quickly and widely.
Right. So that's when things opened up. They called it Glasnost, and
Yeah.
and it was an experiment that we in America thought after after the Berlin Wall fell and Gorbachev was there, Americans thought that we could be optimistic about maybe Russia and the Soviet Union as it was breaking apart. We thought that it could join the Western democracies, but that hasn't happened. But you were fortunate with your family to get out before it became Putinized, which we're living with now. So I want to start a slideshow so we can talk more about your coming to America, what family members came with you, your husband, the two children you had in Minsk and brought with you here. So let's take a look at that, and then we can finish the story by seeing some of these images that you've provided me. Okay. Can you see that, Helen?
Oh. Yes, it's coming. Yep.
Okay, I got to get rid of this here. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, Helen Elperina from Russia to America. Let's see what we have. I got to get rid of that. Okay. Now, you sent me this Rabbi S.B. Halperin. Who is that?
Yeah. This is my great-grandfather who came to America at the beginning of the century, was the first part of the family, and he became a rabbi in Roxbury, New York. So that's the lost part of we were lost part, but that's a part of the family. He's part of the family that came at the beginning of the century.
Now, is that just another version of Elperin?
Yeah, Elperina is just female suffix. The A at the end just tells you that it's female, but it's Halperns, Alperns. It's all the same last name.
Okay.
And that's Elperina, yeah. It's my parents, very young, just married.
So what was your father's first name? Oleg?
Oleg. And my
mother
was Deborah. Yeah. Yes, that's when I was little with them.
And what did your mother do?
She was a teacher of Russian literature and language, and she was a very, very bright, capable woman, very active, very really, she loved life, and both of them were very much intellectuals.
Yeah. And your dad was a physics teacher?
He was a physics teacher.
He
was a physics teacher for the same reason. He graduated university, and he was number one in his class. But because he was Jewish, 3 Jewish kids in his group were sent to work as teachers in remote villages, while people who were very often at the bottom of the class, but who had right last name, they were accepted to work on PhD.
Now, Helen, did you have any brothers or sisters?
I have a brother, and he lives in this area too. Yeah. Yeah, it's me as my father. Yes, this is. I'm with my brother and my mom and my grandmother, who was also a teacher and who was an absolutely brilliant woman. And she grew up in the shtetl, and all my knowledge about life in the shtetl comes from her. Wow. She told me hours and hours of stories about her life in the shtetl, and I still remember it.
You look very much like your mother in this photo. Do you think so? I
Yeah,
think so. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
that's got married in 1976. Yeah, and my husband is, we're still young.
And how did you and your husband meet?
It's also a long story, but to make it short, he went to the same, we went to the same Polytechnical Institute. So he was an engineer, and I was an engineer, and somehow we met. But we met also through the family connection before, but we never were interested. But at some point, we became very interested in each other and got married.
Uh-huh. And your husband, what is his profession?
He is a mechanical engineer.
Uh-huh.
And he's still a mechanical engineer now.
Whoops, I've missed one. I have to go. Well, I'm not going to go back. Let's look
Okay,
at
no,
this.
no, no. This is my favorite picture. It is taken 10 minutes before we left Soviet Union. We are waiting for a train on a platform, and a group of friends and relatives came to say goodbye. And my little kid who is at the bottom of the picture, Paul, he is crying with my
Oh, I
mother.
see it right here. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and that was the last 15 minutes in Soviet Union, and we didn't know what to expect. We had very little money, and suitcases which we had to make ourselves were filled with buckwheat and rice and all kinds of things to survive, just basic food.
Now, how long did it take you to finally get the papers to be able to come to the U.S.?
We had to wait. Roughly, we left Soviet Union um in September, and we stayed a month in Austria waiting the transport to go to Italy, and we were waiting in Italy for a couple more months. But in December, beginning of December '89, we were able to leave for the United States.
All right. So this is your son at the very bottom of the picture, the one who was crying. And
Yeah,
is this your dad right to the right of him?
right next to him. Yeah, yeah.
And what happened to your mom? When did
Oh,
she
she is also in this picture. She is, I think it is a little bit cut, so you cannot see her at this, but she is on this picture too. It's just hard to see, which is okay.
Oh, now what happened to you? Did your mom and dad come with you to America on that occasion or later?
They were able, and we are extremely grateful, and we were extremely happy that it worked out. They were able to come 2 years after us,
Okay.
and they lived with us all these years. They passed away.
And when your dad came to America, did he go to work or was he retired by
He
then?
was retired. He was in his late in his 60, but they learned English. They went to adult education, and he was volunteering very much in everything he could. My mother got very sick, and she couldn't do too much, but he was helping in Solomon Schechter Academy to teach chess to kids, and he became a big part of Encounter Survivors program, and
Right.
he worked with these kids for years.
And that's the program where, countering as a survivor himself, he taught kids in the high schools about his experiences in World War II with the Nazis, right?
Exactly.
Yes. And so when did you lose your parents? Your dad died just last year, a couple of years
Uh,
ago?
2 years ago, and my mother died in 7 years ago. Yeah,
Okay. But they were both living here with you
they
in
were
America.
both living here, and we feel very grateful to this country that we were able to bring them, and they had wonderful lives. They were absolutely um, loyal and grateful to the United States, and they really understood uh, this country, I think, and they really appreciated everything that
Yes.
they
Well,
saw.
don't you think you have to lose something or sense the loss before you can appreciate what you have? And so people like you, and I know my mother who came here fleeing Russia, I think they have an extra appreciation for what freedom means in America, which many Americans take for granted, right?
I think very much it's a case because when people complain and they don't have very often anything to compare to.
Right.
And when you talk to many, many immigrants from, and it's interesting, sometimes I talk to people whose families came from Cuba or any place from Latin America, and we understand each other right away because we left mostly socialist countries behind, where there was no hope of anything good to happen for our families. And we appreciate the freedom that we get here very, very much.
Right. So you're in this picture too. You're here on the left hand, right?
Yeah,
Even though you're
yeah,
looking to your left. And your
yeah,
husband, is he the one up here in the top
yeah.
right?
Yes, yes, he's the tallest one.
Okay. And where's your other son? You have two. You had your two
My
children.
it's hard to see for me on this screen, but my other son is also he is on the right, standing right behind my father.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. I see him. He's
yeah,
looking down. He's looking
yeah,
down. And the
yes.
other people were friends who just came to see you off.
No, we came actually. Part of them are friends, but we left with my husband's sister and her family and his parents and even his grandmother, who you can see on the. She was 80 years old, and it was very confusing for her. But she decided she wants to go with her children. So we came as a big family. We were
Oh,
very
okay.
happy. Yeah,
Whoops. Well, we could look at
yeah,
this
it's
one.
fine.
Soviet families arrive in area. There it is.
Yes, and that's how we came. Like you can see all four children, two mine and two my from my sister-in-law, and uh, people who were meeting us were Rip Levin, who was the president of Federation at the time, and Jerry Fisher, who was the chair of Federation, and our relatives who were living in the area, who immigrated 10 years before us.
And that's you in the big fur hat, right? Is that
I am
you?
yes, I am in a big hat, yeah, in a white
And
hat.
that's your husband is the tallest one in the group,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes, yes,
Okay.
always.
And there was an article in the New London Day, as well as an article in the Leader, obviously, in 1989. And here's another, that's the same picture, only a
Same
really
picture.
better quality of
Yeah,
the
it's the same
photos.
picture.
And your children are, which ones are your two?
The tallest one and the smallest one.
Okay, the biggest one and the smallest one. Great. Okay. And there you are today. So your kid, how old are your kids now? They're adults now.
Yes,
Obviously.
one is 43 and one is 34.
Okay. And did they stay in the scientific fields when they went to school?
They actually they're both economists, but
Uh-huh.
they're very much very good with programming and mathematics and science, and um, they were not interested in engineering, and thank God that they could choose the areas that they're interested in.
Right. And you've got grandchildren?
Yes, our oldest son has two beautiful girls, which we love absolutely.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Ah, describe this picture. I see you. And,
When we came to the United States, our kids, we were very lucky. Kids went to Solomon Schechter Academy, which is a small Jewish school in London at that time. And they will learn basically everything about Judaism from them. They went to school and we went to school with them. And my oldest son had bar mitzvah after half a year in the country. And he was able to learn Hebrew, and he had bar mitzvah right away. And the younger one had bar mitzvah later. When we came, he was 4 years old. So when he was 13, he had a bar mitzvah. And all the family, you can see how everybody is happy. He's holding Torah. And it was a beautiful event.
Now, is that your dad in the front?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
who is the man behind you?
This is my father-in-law, my husband's father, and two
Is that your
grandmothers.
mother?
My
Is that your
mother,
mother?
my father-in-law. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And your husband is in the back. And who is the person in front of your husband?
This is my daughter-in-law and my son on the left, both of them.
Okay.
I think my husband is taking picture. I don't think he is even on this picture. Unfortunately,
Okay.
he's always the one who is taking pictures.
Now, you in 2006, you were honored during the 9th Annual Immigrant Day ceremony in the Old Judiciary Room at the State Capitol in Hartford, Tuesday, April 18th at 1 p.m. Tell us about how you got that honor. That's terrific.
I really don't know. I think I was nominated by Jewish Federation, but it was a big honor, and I felt it was a very interesting experience because when we went there with my husband, we met so many people from different places, from different countries, uh, with such a diverse experience. And all of them had one thing in common. We all had very deep appreciation for this country. And the keynote speaker was, I don't remember what country he was, one of the African countries, was a guy who said it very strongly. He said that in a way, immigrants are ambassadors of goodwill in America in a sense that we know how bad it is behind. We know how terrible things could be in other countries, and we could compare.
So
And
I want to read the bottom part because it gives so much history that we were talking about. You came in 1990. It was part of the Refugee Resettlement Program of the Council of Jewish Federations. You lived in a small place in New London, and then your husband, Michael. Do you call him? Is it Michael or Michael?
his official name is Mikhail, like Gorbachev,
Right.
Mikhail, but we call it Michael. Yeah, here
Right.
it's.
And the two children are Dimitri and Paul. And you became a teacher at New London High School first. You went to UConn, Avery Point, but then, and you are still today at Branford High School since 1994. You have earned a Teacher of the Year award, including many other accolades for the programs that you've established, the Yale Physics Olympics. You've been a coach there and done so much for education in the sciences. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, with the next slide, because this one is the history of your teaching at Branford and the honors that you've received there, Teacher of the Year 2007, 2008, and your trip to Japan. Tell us about your overall thoughts about your experiences teaching physics in this country and how much it has meant to you and meant to your students.
I think in general, to be good, you have to love kids, and it's almost in your blood. I just love teaching, and I feel very much at ease with children. And I teach kids, they are not really kids at the time, 17 16 years old, seniors and juniors. And I just enjoy it very much. It is a wonderful experience to teach and to do it differently. And I think because I have such in kind of diverse background, I taught in Soviet Union. I went to Japan to see how they are doing it. I am teaching many years in the United States. You kind of get to use the best from each, and hopefully it works.
Okay, so this is the slide that shows you as a teacher, but in another context. This is after your dad died. The Encountering Survivors program had you as a child of a Holocaust survivor teaching at a school, and here you are engaging with one of the kids. How did you find that experience with your dad gone and you picking up the heritage of now being the person to carry that information forward for people to remember?
It was very difficult, but I just couldn't, I couldn't leave these kids on an open with it. They met him twice and he died, and I decided that I really should continue. And it was very beneficial for me and for kids to talk about him and his experience. And they loved meeting him. He was very funny. He had almost no filters. They had a great time with him because he was very easygoing and fun. And they really got a lot out of meeting him.
And here we have you and one of your kids at their graduation, right?
Yes. I think it is. I try to remember. I think this is at Amherst College graduation of my older son. Yeah. Kids. We're very grateful. Our kids both got wonderful education and great opportunities, and it certainly wouldn't be possible in any other country. Yeah, and this is my youngest son, graduate in Brandeis. So also, 3 of the grandparents came with us to be present.
So that's your dad on the right and your husband's dad on the left?
Well, yes, it's my in-laws, my father-in-law and mother-in-law around Paul. Yeah.
Right. Okay. That was a wonderful show, I think.
It was well done. Thank you.
So let's get back to kind of summarizing. Is there anything that we left out of your story that you think our viewers and listeners would like to hear about your experiences? You've had a tremendous journey that many of us who are born in America, as we said before, we take for granted the privileges that even as Jews in America have had difficult times. There has been anti-Semitism. We still have so many more privileges and opportunities than you could have ever dreamed of growing up in the Soviet Union. So give us a talk about how we have to remember those ideals.
I think it's so important that with all our problems here, with all the unrest we have, it is a wonderful country, and it is much better place than many other places on earth. And democracy is messy. It works hard way, not always finding the linear route. But nevertheless, my hope is it will work. And we have to talk to each other and we have to listen to each other. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There is no one truth for everybody.
Right. I thank you so much, Helen, for sharing your life with us, your story, your thoughts and ideas. And I want everybody to know that this is the beginning of our various programs leading up to our April 11th, 2021, Sunday afternoon program, Seeking Refuge from Shanghai and Beyond. Henny Simon, our Holocaust survivor, who we honor every year, her father went to Shanghai. Our special guest for the program that will be there with Helen and her story. She's the beyond part. Professor Lawrence Tribe, a great constitutional lawyer and professor from Harvard University, who was born in Shanghai in 1941 as his parents fled the Holocaust years in Eastern Europe. So Helen is part of that stream that we're working through, and we'll be hearing more about it. And Helen, we're going to put something together for the leader on your story, with your permission, as we go forward, because you're part of the stream of Jewish history from hundreds of years, where we find ourselves strangers in strange lands, discriminated against. Sometimes we don't make it. We're always seeking refuge, and you found America. And we're glad that you're here and are contributing so much to this country. It was a pleasure talking with you, and we'll see you soon. So everybody, till next time on Talk Back, have a great day. See you next time. Bye. Bye, Helen.